So good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started so that we can leave as much time as possible for our two featured guests tonight. But thank you all for joining us tonight. We have a really busy schedule, so I'm really excited to really be able to feature both Joe Riis and Rick Ridgeway tonight. But before we do, I just want to give a special thanks to all the sponsors that help make this possible. Sunlight Sports has always been a cornerstone in this community, and they help donate for this event. And the Bobby Modell Charitable Fund, the Greg Moga III and Rebecca Martin, who are both here tonight. Thank you both. Exploration Connections, Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, Patagonia, and Sage Creek Ranch all had a role in bringing these two together with us tonight. So tonight we're going to hear from Joe Riis and Rick Ridgeway. Joe will be moderating the Q&A session following Rick's presentation, and if Joe's name is familiar to you all, well, it should be for good reason. Joe is a wildlife biologist with a knack for capturing some of the most iconic images in film of large-scale migrations. In his book, Yellowstone Migrations, is just one example of his abilities with a camera and a pen, but his story and commitment to wildlife starts much earlier. Joe's work to document the migration of pronghorn led to the discovery of the longest wildlife migration corridor in the lower 48. His efforts to document the arduous nature of these migrations and the barriers these animals face helped establish the Trappers Point Overpass near Pinedale, Wyoming. Joe aims to give migratory animals a visual voice in our current human culture. In 2013, Joe Riis, along with research partner and close friend Dr. Arthur Middleton, were awarded the Camp Monaco Prize to further document and study migrations of wildlife in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Joe's photography and film were a central focus of the resulting Invisible Boundaries exhibit. Not one to sit still for long, Joe's talents and work ethic have led him to 5 continents for National Geographic magazine assignments and work with the BBC, for which he has received film accolades. Without further ado, please welcome the moderator of tonight's presentation, Mr. Joe Riis.
Thank you. Thank you, Corey. Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Corey. That was one heck of an introduction. Hopefully I can do the same for Rick. So it feels good to be here at this museum with so many friends and Okay, can you hear me now better? Okay. He showed me how to go up. Okay, is that better? Yeah. This is new, yeah. So it feels good to be here this evening at this museum with so many friends and family. I'm all here to hear Rick Ridgeway speak. One of my main idols in my life and my mentor. And this museum has been special to me for a long time. I had my first big show here in about a decade ago on the pronghorn migration here in the Bunker Sands Gallery. And then after that, we worked on an elk migration project that Corey mentioned, and that also ended up in an exhibition here in 2016. That photo on the right was part of that exhibition, and that was worth about 3 years of field work. And it's a calf elk, about 3 to 4 weeks old, migrating to its summer range in the Thoroughfare Valley, and it's learning the migration for the first time from its mother. That picture was printed 12 foot wide on metal just in the exhibition room right out here. That was a proud moment for me. And I enjoyed living here in Cody for those 3 years and getting to know a lot of you guys that are here this evening. And so I thought I'd thank a few of you here that made this event possible. And first, Ann Young and Faith Modell, thank you for making this happen. And also thanks to Rebecca Martin for making this event happen. And so for all of you who don't know Rebecca, she worked at National Geographic for about 30 years, and she's how I got my start with National Geographic, and she also helped Bobby Modell get his start there as well. And we all miss Bobby. And I'd also like to thank Doug McWhirter, who's here this evening, and he's retired now, but he worked for Wyoming Game and Fish for his whole career, and he is who really showed me the elk migration. And he worked here in Cody, and if it wasn't for his work, my photo work wouldn't have happened. And so he paved the way on that elk migration, and he's here this evening, and he's someone who I will always be forever indebted to. And okay, so I thought I would take this opportunity to share some of my most recent my most recent work. And I've been in Mongolia a lot this past couple years, about half of my time. And thankfully, I have a very wonderful wife who allows me to do this. Lucy was here this evening, and my son Leo as well, as you saw. And so I've been here in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia on 6 trips this past year and a half, shooting film and photos in the Gobi Desert. And specifically, the Gobi is a very big, vast area, and in the middle of it, there's a mountainous region that's protected, and that protected area is about 7 times the size of Yellowstone. And that area has some very unique animals that only live there. They're rare, they're sparse. The Gobi bear is one, the Bactrian camel is another. There's also snow leopards and lynx and a whole web of life that lives in this mountainous high desert area it's quite amazing. And I thought I would share one of my favorite clips that I got from last year of the Bactrian camel, which is a critically endangered camel. This is a scene of 9 males that are migrating south for the winter. I had this camera here for 7 months, and this is the only time that camels passed. Check out those knees and their feet. You know, their bodies are made for this desert. They're incredible animals. So it gets very cold and very hot. And then here's the guy that holds the wisdom. Yeah. Okay, so here's the deal. Rick Ridgeway, he inspired me to do what I do. And I have a vivid memory from when I was 18. I was in South Dakota where I grew up. And so in South Dakota, I grew up thinking about migrations through the bird migrations, through the waterfowl, the geese and the ducks and hunting. And so that was kind of my idea of animal migration. And my vivid memory is one morning, I think it was a Saturday morning, I went down in my living room in my parents' house, my house, and I sat down on the couch and flipped on the TV and was going to watch Good Morning America with Katie Couric. And she was interviewing Rick Ridgeway and about his expedition in the Chongtong Plateau following the Shuru migration. And after I watched that, my perspective of migration changed, and I got his book, The Big Open, and I read that. And it was very inspiring for me at the time of my life, and it changed the way I thought. And then my life proceeded. I went to college at the University of Wyoming, and as I was graduating college, a lot of different things happened, and I got a call from Rick Ridgeway, and the next thing I knew, we were walking from Jackson to Pinedale following the pronghorn migration. And so here I am with my idol, and I'm at the beginning of my pronghorn project, which was over 15 years ago, and I don't know what my words are for it, but it was incredible. And like that pack right there has been up, some of the tallest mountains in the world. Now I'm just hanging out with him. So these are some pictures from that 10-day walk. Here we're crossing the Gros Ventre. And then here's Rick handing me some of the best cheese I'd ever tasted. And then a storm came and the pronghorn started to move. Here I set up a camera trap on myself. And then that day we saw over 700 pronghorn that crossed Trappers Point. It was an incredible day. A lot of animals on the move. And so this work is continued. Come on up, Leo. So I'm going to show some of my more, so I've continued this work, and now I'll show some of my more recent pronghorn work on this same migration. And so pronghorn are my favorite animal. They are so beautiful and elegant, and they have that ancient wisdom. And I'm looking forward to filming them next couple of years. Pronghorn, Leo. No, it's not. So it looks like it locked up there. So, but that's perfect because it's right at the end. So I'm going to play an excerpt from Rick's book because it explains that Chongtong trip that inspired me so much, and I'd like to have you guys hear it from his voice. Let me just grab it. There it is. I found it.
The Chongtong Traverse was one of the most rigorous expeditions of my life. When I departed, my hair was brown, and when I returned, it was gray. But it was also one of the most fulfilling. It required the strength and skills I had developed as a mountaineer, especially the ability to keep putting one foot in front of the other. It required strategic thinking and planning. It required teamwork and avoiding conflict while under physical stress. The best part was that it...
Is that done? Okay. All right. So that to me is legendary, and it's so inspiring to hear about, and that's just a few months of Rick's life, you know? And so, Rick, thanks for being here, and it's just amazing that you're here with us and for showing us and me what's possible in the life. So Rick, come on up. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Joe. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Got to lower it down. Yeah, let me make sure I got this set up right. Yeah. How's that? Well, before I start, I also need to repeat some of the thanks that Joe made in his introduction to everyone here at the museum, all the individuals who hosted this, Rebecca, who's brought us all together. Yeah, Greg, all of you, thank you so much. And I'll start back in 1980 when I was invited to join a team of mountaineers to go to the People's Republic of China. And this was to attempt to climb a 25,000-foot mountain called Minyakonka, and it was my kind of trip. It was a remote region that was nearly unknown to the outside world, and it was with a team of close friends that included Yvonne Chouinard, who you see here making the first ascent of the Great Wall of China, or maybe the first non-Mongolian ascent. And another close friend was Jonathan Wright. And Jonathan was both my climbing partner and my business partner. I was a writer and he was a photographer. And after the climb, we had a deal with National Geographic to journey from eastern Tibet to Nepal and do a story on what then was only the newly chartered Mount Everest National Park. And for Jonathan and me, it was a dream come true. And things were going okay until one day at 20,000 feet. There were 4 of us, including Yvonne and Jonathan, and we all got caught in an avalanche. And we were swept down the side of the mountain, 1,500 vertical feet. And I was sure there was no way I was going to get out of it alive. But then the snow slowed and stopped, and all of us, though, were injured. But none of us as badly as Jonathan. And I tried to keep him alive, encouraging him, giving him mouth-to-mouth, but after about a half hour, he died in my arms. And the next day, I buried him under a mound of rocks and went home. And I had to go into a deep introspection, asking myself if I should keep climbing, and I didn't know if I could. And it took me 2 years to think it through, to think about what I'd learned, what I'd taken from the high elevations and brought down to my life at sea level. I thought about how in my early 20s I'd worked hard to learn how to be a high-altitude mountaineer, and how that had led to an invitation to join what back in the mid-'70s was only the second American expedition to climb Mount Everest. And I thought how that had led to an invitation to join a team to attempt K2, the second highest peak in the world, and today regarded as the hardest and most dangerous high altitude peak there is to climb. And I thought about how deep I had to keep digging to put one foot in front of the other on a climb where there was no Sherpas to help us out. And after we set up Camp 1 and then Camp 2, some of the team carried supplies while others pushed the route further up the mountain. And we were now ready for this, the knife edge. It was almost a mile long and had an average elevation of about 23,000 feet. But we only managed to get started, and the weather turned, and at first we stayed in our high camp, hoping that the storm was going to be short, but we were eating food and burning fuel that we'd really worked hard to carry up, and we had no choice finally but to go down all the way to base camp. And the storm lasted about a week, and then it cleared, and we had to climb back up our ropes, and that took several days, and we'd only started pushing the route higher when the next storm hit, and once again, all the way back down to base camp. And there were 6 storms on this climb, and altogether, after each one, we struggled to dig out our tents, and now, looking up, we still had the summit headwall in front of us, and timbers were thin, and so was the food supply. And at this point, we'd been on the climb for nearly 2 months. And then 4 of us were selected to make an 11th hour last-ditch attempt at the summit. And we put in one more camp at 26,000 feet. And then the next day, the weather held, but the climbing, well, it was hard. And there was one section at 27,500, and we were climbing without oxygen, where we had to climb over steep rock covered with ice. And it just took everything I could concentrate to make one foot in front of the other. But finally, later in the day, I reached the summit, and you recognize that's the photograph on the cover of the book, on a day that was clearly perfect. But I was so exhausted, I just had to keep telling myself to stay focused, to somehow get down alive. And that took 5 days. But finally, we got back to base camp, and we were greeted by the rest of the team, and we'd made it. The first American ascent of K2, the first ascent ever without supplemental oxygen. And I took that lesson of tenacity back home, and whenever I encountered an obstacle that I didn't know if I could get over or not, I would remind myself of that we had stayed above base camp, above 18,000 feet for 68 days in a row, without ever giving in or giving up. And it became this yardstick that I used to measure my sea level challenges, and it really worked. And then there were other lessons, like how on a climb you make a plan, but inevitably stuff goes wrong, and you got to be flexible, you got to know how to adjust. And then maybe the most important lesson, and it was in a lot of ways the hardest to learn because it's pretty subtle. So subtle you can't see it, you can miss it, but it's that how the real goal really isn't the summit at all, but it's the footsteps that it takes to get there. It's the process. It's the how you get there that counts. And I wrote that in some of your books here this afternoon, and that's what's behind it. Then after that avalanche, I realized that I wasn't the same person before. Sometimes I woke up just amazed that I was still alive. And I remember one day I was walking from my car into my office, and I just stopped in the parking lot and stood there to feel the difference in the side of my face that was in sun from the side that was in shadow. And in a way, it was like feeling reborn with this new awareness of what it means just to be alive, to stand in the parking lot in the sunshine. And with that, it was a new awareness about how quickly any of us cannot be alive. A few years later, I ran into that poem by Mary Oliver, her famous one called Summer's Day, with that last line that summarized my challenge. When she said, tell me what you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. And that was it. And it was a challenge that included this decision whether I was going to go back to mountaineering, to climbing. But then meanwhile, I had my professional life working as a writer and a filmmaker and a photographer. And Jonathan, my friend who had died in my arms, his family asked me to complete that story for National Geographic that he and I had been working on, the one about the newly chartered Mount Everest National Park. So I decided to do it for him, for his wife, and maybe most importantly for the 13-month-old baby girl that he left behind when he died. So I went back to Kathmandu, and I had Joe, you probably had this experience, but this was my first big job with National Geographic, and they sent me with this expense account. Like, I had more money than I'd ever seen in my life. So I checked into the best hotel I could find, the Yak and Yeti, and there was this beautiful woman in the lobby, and I had the guy send her a drink, and she came over and wanted to know where I lived, and I said, oh, I've got this beach cottage just south of Santa Barbara. Well, the reality was it was a surfer's shack just north of Oxnard, but the line worked, and about a year later, Jennifer and I got married, and I come to realize that it wasn't a coincidence that I made this shift in my life, so soon after that avalanche, and it wasn't a chance that we started our family right away, and of course that made it a lot more difficult to decide whether to return to mountaineering, but that's what I did. And so much of who I had become was from my time in the mountains, and more importantly, even my time in wildness and wild nature. And even with the family, I kept asking myself whether the rewards were worth the risk. And what if the right people came along with the right project? Would I consider going back? And if I did, what would Jennifer think? And then it happened. I got a call from these two guys. That's Frank Wells on the right, and at the time, he was the president of Warner Brothers Studios, and Dick Bass owned the Snowbird Ski Resort. And by coincidence, these two learned that they shared a lifelong dream to climb the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. Back then, nobody had ever done that. Nobody had even thought about it. But these guys didn't have very much climbing experience. They were both 50 years old, and at first, I just thought they were having a midlifer. But they were also going to need guides and help organizing the expeditions, and they invited me to join them. So, I asked Jennifer what she thought, and she said, maybe the bigger risk is not going. It's not staying true to who you are. And think about this. Maybe it's not meeting new people like Frank and Dick that might take me in different directions. She said, look, you're going to be guiding these guys, of course, but maybe in turn they can guide you in new directions. And it wasn't going to be the first time I realized that in a marriage to the right person, 1 + 1 equals a lot more than 2. So I decided to go on 3 of these 7 summit climbs, including the one to Vincent Massif, the highest mountain in Antarctica. And we were the first private expedition ever to go into the interior of Antarctica. And we all got to the top. This is a shot of me on the summit of what then was only the 3rd ascent of Mount Vincent. And Frank and Dick went on to several other of the climbs, but they missed Everest. And even though Frank had to go back to work, Dick went back at age 55 and he reached the summit. And he became the first to climb the 7 summits. And back at base camp, he called me on the satellite phone, and he said, his voice was wizened, "It just goes to show you, Rick, that the second half," and I knew that was Dick's shorthand for life after 50, "the second half can be and should be the best half." So, Jennifer was right. These guys were guiding me as much as I was guiding them and inspiring me with a new confidence to live my life in the wild parts of the world. And in the years that followed, I had other mentors. I've got to be one myself, or guys like my friend Joe here. The biggest 2 in my life were Yvonne Chouinard on the right and Doug Tompkins. And these 2 guys had been close friends and climbing partners since the early 60s. And they were both entrepreneurs, and Doug had a small business making sleeping bags and packs, and then later he added some parkas and jackets, and he decided to call his new startup the North Face. And it included a retail store in North Beach in San Francisco. Oh boy, that was a scene. At the opening night, they had this new band called the Grateful Dead to play for him. And then meanwhile, Yvonne had a small business further south down in the surf town of Ventura, and he was working as a blacksmith making rock climbing and mountaineering gear. And then in 1968, Yvonne and Doug shared an adventure when they bought this old Ford van and drove it all the way from southern Argentina to attempt to climb this mythical peak called Fitzroy. And this trip had a huge influence on them. And it had an enormous influence on me, one generation younger, and all my outdoor buddies. And I've had close friends from subsequent generations tell me that this was the most influential trip of them all. And Jimmy Chin, for example, has told me that. But here's Doug and Yvonne to tell you a little bit about it themselves.
And picked up a 16mm Bolex camera to record the trip. Loaded the car up with surfboards and climbing gear and took off for a 10,000-mile trip down south. I think from the time we decided to go was like 2 weeks before we went. We bought this old van and took off from Ventura. 1968, you gotta remember the Pan American Highway was pretty wild. It was dirt road from Mexico City all the way south. It was like being in Montana or Wyoming 100 years ago. Here we're in an area that's the size of the whole American West, with no people.
For those of us that grew up going out into the wilds of the world, where nature was basically untouched, we got into our souls a sense of beauty.
That trip had a big influence on both Doug and I. It kind of set the course for what we were going to do later in life. For me, it was the best trip of my life.
Well, they finally got home. Took them 8 months after they got to the summit for the whole trip. And Doug, once they got home, discovered that Susie had started her own company that was making women's dresses. And she was selling a lot more dresses than he was selling packs and tents and sleeping bags. So he sold the North Face, and he partnered with her, and they rebranded the company as Esprit. And then in the 70s, the whole thing started to take off. And at the same time, down south in Ventura, Yvonne was expanding his company to include a few items of clothing. And they were made with the same dedication to quality and durability as the climbing hardware. And then in the early 70s, he decided to spin off the clothing part into a separate business. And he was looking for a name. And this was only 5 years after he and Doug had climbed Fitzroy, that high peak there. And that's where the inspiration came from. That high peak on the label of your jacket is Fitzroy. And this was just after I had met Yvonne in the early 70s. And he and I hit it off, and we started going on climbing adventures ourselves around the world. I mean, here's a photo of two of us celebrating a successful ascent of Denali in 1980. And well, I'll just say there's a lot more than alcohol involved, and leave it at that. But a couple of years later, Yvonne introduced me to Doug, and the three of us started going on expeditions, including a sea kayaking trip to Tierra del Fuego, where we paddled in an uninhabited fjord and stopped to climb a pretty difficult peak in high winds and icy rain and terrible conditions. And then back on our boats, we paddled for another week in water that was just above freezing, and Yvonne flipped in a strong wind, and we really had to fight hard to get him ashore. And then during the trip, he had his 50th birthday, And that was a really big milestone for him. And it was a big moment of reflection. He didn't know if he still had it in him or not. But then finally at the end of the trip, after we'd pulled it all off, he had a big smile on his face, and he came over and he said, "You know, this trip was just what I needed." Now on all these trips, Doug brought a lot of books that he was reading, and he would pass them to me. And around our campfires, our conversations would inevitably turn to the twin crises of climate and extinction, to the degradation of nature that we were witnessing with our own eyes, seeing forests clear-cut that were going to take generations to regrow if they ever did, witnessing the overgrazing of grasslands that were turning into deserts. And maybe the most alarming, we were witnessing with our own eyes the glaciers that we'd climbed in our youth melt and disappear. We were witnessing geologic time happening in human time. And when we witnessed this planetary change, when we began to understand it at a visceral level, then we felt morally obligated to do something about it. And since we were in business, we began to ask ourselves how we could use business as a tool for protection of the environment. You know, for our health and our family's health, of course, but also we realized for the health of our businesses. And since Yvonne started Patagonia in 1973, I'd done contract work with him, helping with the marketing, and then in the early aughts, I joined the company as an employee, and I had a 15-year run there, overseeing their global environmental initiatives. But before that, starting in the 80s, my wife Jennifer had joined the company as the company's first marketing director, overseeing the image of the company, and she and Yvonne created the first Patagonia catalogs that really recognized the company's culture and reflected its deepest beliefs and values, including its dirtbag origins in places like Climbers Camp and Yosemite. And, you know, clothing companies didn't run photographs like this in their catalogs in those days. And some of the photographs captured the company's spirit and culture and our sense of humor. You know, not to mention our belief that how technology was separating us from the real world, but some of the photographs also showed what it was like to be in the real world, where things didn't always go as planned. And photographs like this one, you know, they set a new bar in corporate marketing for what authenticity really means. And then at the same time, we were totally committed to environmental protection. And by the 90s, we were giving 1% of our sales to environmental organizations. And that was 1% of sales, not profits. Every year, rain or shine, that money went to grassroots groups like this one trying to save the Colorado River. And I mean, how can you not give a grant to these guys? And then even from the beginning, Patagonia was committed to using its business as a tool for environmental protection. And the most simple of reasons was we realized that there is no business on a dead planet. And we also realized that what was good for the planet at the same time was turning out to be good for business. And as Patagonia's commitment to saving the home planet grew, so did its sales. Now, meanwhile, Doug Tompkins was struggling with the dilemma of his personal passion for protecting nature against the impact of his now giant clothing company, Esprit. And that was causing a lot of harm, he realized, to the planet. You know, he was in fast fashion. And he and Susie were also struggling with their marriage. So in the late 80s, he sold his half of the company to his wife, and he moved to a remote corner of southern Chile and started buying degraded sheep and cattle ranches and then restoring them to protected areas with this idea of someday maybe turning them into national parks. I mean, nobody had thought of anything like that before. Now, this was, as I said, in the early 90s, and Doug eventually, a couple years later, fell in love with this woman, Chris McDivitt. That's Chris on the right. And in addition to being, one of my very best friends, I'll put it this way, other than my wife, Chris is the only person who's been in the delivery room at the birth of all 3 of my children. That kind of friend. She was the founding CEO of Patagonia, and she and Doug fell in love, and she made the difficult choice to leave Patagonia, the company, and move to Patagonia, the place, and join him. And the 2 of them would go on over the next 25 years to create 16 million acres of new national parks in Chile and Argentina. And it's the biggest conservation victory by private individuals in history. And from the beginning, Yvonne and I were on their board of directors, and every year we would go down to Chile and Argentina to visit the projects, and sometimes we would bring prospective donors, and on some of these trips, Doug and Yvonne and I would add a week or 2 to go on an adventure. And this is a photo of the 3 of us on the first ascent of the most emblematic peak in Patagonia National Park. And it's a park that Tompkins Conservation itself created. And Doug later had the Chilean government name the mountain Cerro Cristina after his wife, which was a pretty cool Valentine present. I mean, that one's hard to match. Then in 2015, we all got together again to work on the parks, and afterwards we went on another adventure with some other friends of ours, a kayak trip on a large lake that was on the border of the new park. It was a 5-day trip along an uninhabited coastline, and for the first 3 days things were going right according to plan, and one evening the weather started to turn, and by morning the wind was blowing really hard. And Doug and I were in a double kayak, and it had a faulty rudder, and we were struggling to keep the boat pointed downwind against winds that were coming from different directions, and then a big wave hit us, and we capsized. The water was 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and our friends eventually came back for us, and by the time we got ashore, we were both unconscious. And I managed to recover, but Doug was too hypothermic, and by the time we got to the hospital, he was dead. So we rallied around Chris, and a few days later, we buried him in a small cemetery in the new park that the 2 had just created. And none of us knew for sure that Chris was going to be able to get her way through this. We continued to support her. We watched in awe as she eventually changed out of her black dress and put on her work dress and rolled up her sleeves to get the job done, creating a strategic plan to transfer the parks to the governments, all the ones that were incomplete, get the whole job done in 5 years. Ambitious to the extreme, but she and her team pulled the whole thing off in 4 years. And we were there to watch as she signed the agreements with the president of Chile, creating 5 new national parks, expanding 3 more. And I suspect some of you here have probably seen this new film that Jimmy Chin made that came out in May about Chris and Doug and the rest of us. It's now streaming on Disney Plus, and you should check it out. But just to give you a little preview, here's the trailer.
If you want to understand the entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent. Because they're saying, this sucks, I'm going to do it my own way.
You are born with a certain drive, and I essentially grew up with Yvonne. Doug and Yvonne were people who really and truly thought nothing was impossible.
There was a spirit that united this band of dirtbag climbers and surfers and business people. As Yvonne liked to say, you can't break the rules if you make the rules.
They were true hardcore adventurers, but then they went on to have these hugely successful entrepreneurial lives.
I was getting concerned about the environment. I felt like I was going to push my business to be more and more responsible.
They took what they did in business and were able to show the world what businesses can do to effect such massive change.
Well, last year, some of you may have read Yvonne making a massive change in the company, the biggest in its 50-year history, when they donated all the voting shares of Patagonia to a trust whose board is obligated to manage the company so that all the profits go to an NGO called the Holdfast Collective that grants the money to thousands of environmental groups that are doing the on-the-ground work to save our one and only home planet. And effectively, that means that the planet now owns the company, a totally new business model. In the years I was an employee there, some of my fondest memories were working with the teams of dedicated people who all shared the same passions and commitments to saving the planet. And every summer, that included the interns who filled about 10 positions from a pool of about 10,000 applicants. And it was harder to get an internship at Patagonia than it was to get into Harvard. One year, those interns included a young woman who was a very active outdoor athlete. And she had just turned 20 years old, but she had been only 13 months old when her father, Jonathan, had died in that avalanche in Tibet in my arms. And he had named her Asia after his favorite place in the world. And after we buried him in that remote grave, Yvonne and I stayed in touch, trying to be fill-in fathers. And now she was an intern, and before the summer was over, I knew that she'd probably want to talk to me about him, because her mother had shut his memory out of their lives. Sure enough, she asked me if we could have a talk, and I didn't hold back. I told her in detail about the avalanche, holding her father and looking into his eyes, trying to convince him things were going to be okay, trying to keep him alive. And she thanked me, and then she said, "That's not what I wanted to talk about. I got a favor. I want you to take me to the mountain where he died, and I want to climb it with you and find him." So I told her I needed to think about it. And I went to Jennifer, and she said, "Of course you're going, because she's not asking you to find her father. She's asking you to be her father." And I knew that if Jonathan had lived, he would have taken her on his trips. And those trips would have included Asia, the place. So that's what Asia and I did. We journeyed to the Everest region, where I had a lot of Sherpa friends who had been Jonathan's friends, and now they were Asia's friends. We went to western Tibet, into mountains that had not been explored at all, where we endured really strong winds, and we climbed a 21,000-foot mountain that was unnamed, and at least until that day, unclimbed. In eastern Tibet, we approached the flank of Minyakonka, where her father had died, and it had been 20 years, and I wasn't sure I could find the grave, but finally on this barren high buttress, we found it, but now it had been torn apart, probably by a snow leopard. So his daughter and I gathered his bones and reburied him together, and put fresh prayer flags over the grave, and we started the long journey home. The whole trip took 2 months, and in that time I shared with her the stories and the lessons from those stories that I knew her father would have shared with her. And there's some of the same lessons that I've shared with you this evening about how you have to plan, but know that stuff happens, how you need to be flexible, how you get to the top, one footstep at a time, and how you need to go about your life knowing that it's not about the summit, but about those footsteps, about the way you get there that counts, that in your work life, as well as your home life, your life has to have a purpose. And that purpose needs to be more than just about you, but how you can be more than just yourself. And I told her about my challenge, deciding whether or not to return to living my life in the wild. A challenge that I came to realize is a process that never ends. A challenge that I think everybody here this evening, all of you, need also to consider. That wherever you are on your life's journey, that every day you need to pause and ask yourself, what am I doing with my one wild and precious life? Thanks.
I believe Rick and Joe will entertain some questions. Joe will moderate a Q&A from the audience, so they will have a couple of microphones here, and I will run a microphone around to folks. So if anyone cannot hear the question, then we'll have Joe repeat that question to the audience. But we'll go ahead, and Joe, if you got a few words, go for it. Oh, let me turn them on.
You out there probably have some better questions than me. So I would like to open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a really dumb question.
No.
There are no dumb questions.
No.
I just want to know, you said your hair went from brown to gray. How much time are we talking about, Rick?
2 months. Yeah, 2 kick-ass, hard as I've ever pushed myself months. Yeah. You think, I thought K2 was hard, but pulling a 275-pound cart for 300 miles across the plateau with an average elevation of 17,000 feet ended up being a little bit harder. Yeah. It took everything I had in me and with my buddies to pull that one off. So I was just a little over 50, I think. And Galen Rao was with us, and he was just a little over 60. And then Conrad Anchor was with us, and he was a little over 40. And then we had a space open up. We needed a filmmaker. And Conrad said, well, I know this kid. He's only 29. He's never run a movie camera, but he's a pretty good photographer, and he learns fast, and he's tough as nails, and he's always smiling. His name's Jimmy Chin. So Jimmy came on the trip, and that's where he learned to make movies. It was kind of a proud father moment when he walked up there and got the Academy Award, let me tell you.
So on that trip, I have a question for you, Rick.
Yeah.
As you were describing that, I was so on this trip, it was like, okay, sorry. So this trip, I think, is about 300 miles. That trip was, and they pulled carts that you made or designed. But my question, I guess, is how well did you know what was in front of you? Like did you know what kind of terrain you were going to encounter, or was it kind of?
Well, the backstory for this trip is my acquaintance with the conservation biologist George Schaller. And when I did that trip with Asia Wright, I wanted to take her, as I explained to you guys, across the Tibetan plateau on a trip that her father would have taken her on, like a dream trip. And I wanted to climb a mountain with her, but it had to be one that had 0 chance of elevation or avalanche. Mm-hmm. And the only place I could think of where the snow was stable enough to guarantee no avalanches was in the opposite side of Tibet, in western Tibet. And the only Caucasian Westerner who had ever been out in that region in the last 100 years was George Schaller. There had been a few British and a couple of Swedes that had crossed there between 18 98, and 1907. And after that, nobody. And I went to George, and he helped me figure it out. And so that's where Asia and I went. And I learned from George that his main work out there was centered around this goat antelope called the Shiru, a very unique ungulate that has evolved over the last 10 million years out in this Chongtong Plateau, this super remote place. So remote, there's no human beings out there. Like, it's uninhabited. Kind of in part because it's uninhabitable. But George had noticed that every summer the females would disappear. Give me a second. From the southern part of their range, and they would migrate north to a place called the Kunlun Mountains, totally uninhabited. And then they would come back 2 months later with their newborns. So there had to be calving grounds up there. And he spent over 10 years trying to find where those calving grounds were. He tried going up from the south in vehicles and couldn't get there, it was too rough. He tried coming down from the north across the Kunluns with a caravan of camels. And it was so difficult, the camels were dying. I mean, you know, that's pretty, he couldn't get there. So I went to him and I said, well, what if I got some climbing buddies and we followed the migration on foot? And he said, you can't do that because you got to walk 300 miles. It's uninhabited. There's no human beings out there. You got to carry everything yourself. You got to have water for at least 3 or 4 days, sometimes longer between watering holes. And then once you get past the northern point, a certain point, nobody's been out there. Not even the British 150 years ago. Nobody, no Western human being had ever crossed this 50-mile section, totally unknown. And you can't carry that much weight in your backpack. So I go, okay. And then the next year, I was at the trade show for the outdoor industry called the Outdoor Retailer. And back then they used to have in Salt Lake City, and I had to have a meeting with somebody in the Marriott Hotel across from the Salt Palace, and I was sitting in the lobby waiting for this guy to show up. And I saw this weird-looking bronze statue under the staircase in the lobby, and I went over to check it out, and it was a statue of a Mormon family crossing the Great Plains, and the guy was carrying a rickshaw with everything inside of it, you know, and his family walking alongside, and I go, that's it. We're going to carry rickshaws across the Tibetan Plateau. So I went to George, and he said, that'll do it. He thought, yeah, maybe. So then I went to Rebecca and National Geographic, and they funded the whole thing. And then George was excited because he said, you know, if you guys can discover these calving grounds and you document it and you get the National Geographic to publicize this, I can take that publicity back to the Chinese, and let's see if we can protect these calving grounds before the poachers get there first, because the poachers were decimating these animals for their underwool that was woven into these very expensive fashion shawls for women. It had become a fashion hit. Forgot to tell you that part of the story.
But that's what I saw on TV. That's what
Yeah.
inspired me, is I saw that on TV.
So we did it. We discovered the calving grounds. We made a movie. Rebecca, National Geographic, you know, the movie showed all over the world. They did a magazine article in the main magazine. We went on this lecture tour all over the country. There's even a children's book about it, about the four of us pulling our rickshaws. George took all that publicity back to the Chinese. They created a 15,000 square mile reserve around the calving grounds. I went to the Wildlife Conservation Society in Patagonia, got enough money to subsidize the deployment of patrols in the new reserve for 4 years. After that, the Chinese took over. They've kept it up. Every year since then, the numbers have been increasing. We've turned it around. And that was the most fulfilling trip of my career by far, because it was so much more than going out and climbing a mountain for what? You know, some ego boost to tell you, oh, I made the first ascent of K2, American one. But that pales in comparison to using your skills and applying them to helping save the planet. That was the first time I was able to really do that effectively, and it changed the course of my life and your life. Look at the influence that it's had. So that's a really long answer to your question, but it brings up something else. Somebody may be asking this, but I'm going to ask it myself before you get a chance to. And that's how I ended this show. And it was a challenge to you guys. I did that on purpose. And what I want to say to you is that I didn't challenge you to follow Yvonne Chouinard and Doug Tompkins. I can't do that. I didn't challenge you to follow my footsteps. But I did want to challenge you to think about the tools that you have in your toolbox, because we all have some. And if you know how to write, you got to write about the injustices of the world. And if you know how to speak, you got to get up there and speak out. And if you got extra time, you got to volunteer. And if you got extra money, you got to support the groups. But whatever it is, whatever you got, recognize it and use it. And that's what I hope all of you take home with you this evening and think about. That's what the challenge was. Yeah. Please.
I used to live in Gillette, Campbell County in Wyoming, and Joe, you specialize in the migration of antelope, and I wondered if some don't migrate, because we would see them, look out our window, see antelope 20 below zero. Granted, the herds were much smaller in the winter than in the summer, but they'd be still there. So do some not migrate?
Yeah, maybe some don't migrate. I think most of them are moving with the seasons to get something to eat and have a place to live. I mean, if they're in deep snow, they're not going to just stay there, unless if there had to be a food source at some, But I mean, I have definitely seen pronghorn migrate right past other groups of pronghorn that aren't migrating, that will stay there, or, for like in the Upper Green, for example, there's pronghorn that they'll end up like right around Trapper's Point, and they'll stay there all year long. And then there's other pronghorn that are moving right past them that are continuing on another 50 miles. And so I would say that has something to do with the knowledge that they learned from their mothers. That's what I'd guess. How I set up the camera, like what my thought process is on it? Yeah. The secret is to go up in the mountains and look around and walk around and, just try to think about what the animals would be thinking about and where they would move. They typically are moving, through the easiest possible way they can. Sometimes that way, means like a 5-mile run up a fence and then around and back, and so with regard to, so like the pronghorn walk that Rick and I did, most of that walk was to learn about where the pronghorn were migrating, what trails they were using. Sometimes they're on a single file line, trail, but oftentimes they're on a web of trails that they know, but the only way to really learn that is to walk the migrations and look for trails and try to pay attention to things. The pronghorn, most of them, they like to see far, and so they like to be in the open, and so a lot of the places that it just is possible to film them with a wider angle lens is in their pinch points. So in places where they will go right by a tree or something where that will kind of narrow them down where I can predict. But it's just, the spots are, like over years of just walking and looking around, and it's, I mean, that's what I like to do too, you know, I mean, it's just interesting for me, and you know, as I put a camera out, I'm also learning. I mean, I often put out cameras that I don't get anything from, I mean, which is pretty common. I've definitely gotten used to not getting anything. I mean, more often than not, that's what happens. But when you know, you continue to photograph and film, every once in a while you get a really nice clip, like that camel clip, for example. That's, I mean, that's like 140 field days with 20 cameras in a place I've been to several years, and that's like one of my best clips that I got. And so, yeah, it just takes time, I guess. Thank you.
I remember after we got back from our walk, I was at my friends up right in the front row here, Paul and Phoebe, at their place on the Bighorn River. They're spread there, and I was telling them and the cowboys that work with them about my trip, and the cowboys are kind of screwing up their head, and one of them said, "What's a pronghorn?" And I described the animal, and they go, "You talking about prairie goats?" Yeah, I was. Yeah, yeah.
I was going to ask Joe, with all the building and everything that's going on now across everything, how do they learn to change their migration? How do they, what, you know, teach them a different route?
Well, I would guess necessity. And I mean, there's a lot of places in Wyoming where they can't move, like I-80, for example, is a blockage, and so they want to move south past the interstate, but they can't, and so yeah, they'll try. I mean, often they investigate. They're exploratory animals. Like, they'll try to problem solve it and go up and down a fence, and continue to look, and you know, but those types of occurrences, I mean, they cost energy, and if you add up those types of things, and then you add on some, you know, weather and different things, like, then, you know, they can have a hit like they did this past winter. And so, I mean, I think that they try as best as they can, but if we don't give them an option to continue to move, they can't figure it out. I mean, we need to build overpasses, and fix our fences, and think about how connected our landscape is, and we are. I mean, I think the migratory ungulates in this region are they're a really good example for us to work together. I think because not like one landowner or one federal agency or one government agency or a nonprofit group can do it alone. Like, we all have to work together, and I think they're a good, the ungulate migrations, I think, are a really good thing for us all to work on, and I think this community has, and so has the state of Wyoming, and it seems like the migratory ungulates people are behind them, and we have to figure out now what we need to do to, you know, solve what you're talking about, because that's what it comes down to, is us keeping them alive and not requiring them to do too much that they don't want to do.
This question is for Rick. In your picture show, there's evidence that you've been all over the world. I don't know that there's time in a lifetime to go back to all those places, or even if you want to. And I guess that's my question. In your quest to save the world, are there places that you've been curious about and gone back to see if they've changed and how?
Well, I've had the chance to go back to places that I was, you know, that I'd seen in my youth, and as you can imagine, I've been able to witness some pretty incredible change. But then there's, you know, other places that are still close to what they were, you know, in my youth. And some people ask me, you know, what is my favorite place, and that's really hard to pull out. But I would say that I've been attracted to open spaces even more than the mountains. I've just liked that feeling of what you guys can see out in your part of the world here around Cody. Like, this is a landscape that really resonates with me. And that walk across Tibet was one of my favorite places. And we did cross a 50-mile section that had never been documented before. The Tibetan nomads had probably got out there, even though they don't permanently inhabit that area. But that was pretty incredible to think in the early part of the 21st century that there was still a section on the planet that nobody had seen before. There were satellite photographs, of course, but that was it. Nobody on foot had ever documented it. That was cool. I think that's one of the most special sections of the planet that I've ever got to set foot on and witness. Yeah, it was.
What were some of the qualities of that landscape that you remember that?
The quality that still sticks with me is so ineffable. You know, I make my life writing, and it is so challenging to write about this ineffable feeling you get when you're in a place where there are no human beings and there haven't been any. And it is a wildness that's so different than anything I'd ever felt before. Maybe the closest is when you're in your house and the electricity goes off, things get quiet to a degree that you'd never known about until the electricity comes back on, and there's these humming that you become aware of, you know, that you don't even think about. And when you get into a place on the planet with no human beings, the electricity's turned off, and there's no sound of a human being, and there's no feeling of any indication that they've ever been there before. There's so few places left on the planet like that. Yeah, Mike Fay, the great National Geographic explorer, who's been all over these wild places, he got out into an island north of Tahiti once with no human beings, and nobody inhabited this place. There was nobody had been there, and he got let off to do a survey there. And he was describing it to me, trying to come up with the same description. I said, I know what you're talking about. I felt that before.
So one question that's kind of similar to that revolves around, it's in your book, and it's a story my wife Lucy and I have talked about a lot. And it's when you're on the side of K2 and you see these butterflies. And it's I guess one of those moments in nature that we think about as just like, wow, that, you know, like an awe-inspiring moment. And I'm curious, like, what your experiences were from that day, and kind of, if you just talk about that moment.
Yeah, so I was with my climbing partner, John Roskelley, and we were pushing the route across that knife-edge ridge that you saw in that photograph or the video clip. Just this, you know, you could see it. It was like the edge of a knife, and we couldn't. It was so narrow that we couldn't walk right along the top. I mean, it was just like this, and so we were just below the crest, crabbing sideways on this super steep slope. You know, taking our ice axe like this and reaching out sideways and making side crab crawling movements. And I was belaying John, and I was kind of I was resting. Truth be known, I was just daydreaming, feeding the rope out, you know, in some sort of a half-daze way. And this butterfly landed in front of me. And at first I didn't even think, I said, oh, that's cool. And it looks like the painted lady butterfly from back home. And then I kind of snapped up and I go, wait a minute, I'm at 23,000 feet. What's a butterfly doing? And so I yelled at John, and he goes, yeah, there's some landing around me. And then this swarm of butterflies came up, and some of them got stuck on the snow, and others went right over the ridge and kept going. And, you know, I learned later that that particular species, I think I'm in a minute, I almost remember the Latin name, Vanessa cardui. They are one of the most migratory butternflies. And the butterflies must have been on a migration and got caught in an updraft. Yeah. So it was so magical. It stuck with me. And it stuck with you reading about it.
Yeah, and Lucy.
And
Probably a lot of
Lucy.
other people.
So about 10 years ago, John Roskelley, I got a letter from some guy who was a entomologist, and he said, God, I just read your book, and I read this description of the butterflies, and do you have any photographs? And I said, yeah. So I had John send him some photographs that he took of the butterflies, and then he wrote a paper on it that got published in a peer-reviewed journal. And then these other entomologists started, starting a correspondence with this guy that wrote the article about our sighting on K2, and we got into the Guinness Book of Records as seeing the highest sighting of a butterfly in history. Yeah.
Okay, Ann.
Rick, you're the man that climbs all these treacherous peaks. It's so impressive, but I'm also impressed that you are fascinated with gopher turtles.
Oh.
I was wondering if you could tie your work with the gopher turtles
Yeah.
into climbing these peaks.
Did you guys hear in the back? I was having dinner with Ann yesterday, and I told her that I live in Ojai, California, and I'm just privileged to live in the middle of this kind of large compound of the Turtle Conservancy, and I'm on the board of the NGO, and we've got, I have 650 turtles and tortoises living around my house from about 45 species in this little small cottage that I've got. And my grandkids live in town, and they think it's so cool because their grandpa lives in a zoo, But I like Joe, you told me that I'm your mentor, but I've learned a lot from you too, and it's this passion for our brethren wildlife that we share, that I know probably every single person in the audience here shares as well. And I've been I've been on the board now for 7 or 8 years, and the board includes the world's leading experts on what are called chelonians, Latin for turtles and tortoises. And I've been working to learn as much as I can from these guys and doing my own research. I've been a birder, Joe knows this because I was always getting my binoculars out looking for birds on our walk, following those pronghorn. I've been a birder since I was 25 years old. Like, that's a passion of mine. And I don't know, when I'm with these turtle guys, the leading experts, and we're in, a group of people, and I'm getting introduced, they always say, oh, this is Rick, our board member, who's the bird guy. And I say, no, I'm earning my turtle stripes. And I guess I haven't got there yet, but I just have a growing passion for turtles and tortoises. I'm leaving on Friday for India. That's why I got to leave here in the morning to do a turtle survey in the Western Ghats. And we're hoping to initiate a new conservation project to create a wildlife, a protected area, protecting a corridor that would connect 2 other existing preserves that are critical to 2 very endangered species of turtles and tortoises. So that's our mission. But I don't know, I'm just passionate about them, but I'm passionate about all critters, like most of you guys are here. But if you never get a chance to hold a a turtle and look in their face. A lot of you have. No, it depends on what the species is. You don't want to do that to a snapping turtle. But you're looking into deep time, and it's a wonderful experience to hold that animal, and it's humbling because they've been here so much longer than we have. Yeah, and the more I learn about them, well, it's like it's just another part of the magic of our life on Earth. I mean, I've learned that my passion for birds is maybe connected to my passion for turtles and tortoises because, studying their evolution, I've come to learn that as a order, turtles and tortoises are more closely allied to birds than they are to lizards and crocodiles. Yeah. I know that, of course, birds were from dinosaurs, and they had a common ancestor with turtles and tortoises. Sir?
Yeah, Rick, I was going to ask you, how optimistic are you that people will accept the challenge globally, and humanity will actually reverse the degradation that we've done to this planet?
Well,
Feel about that, where we're headed.
yeah, the path is there. Another group I work with is called One Earth, and we've raised quite a bit of money over the years to fund scientists who have confirmed with peer-reviewed research that's all been published now what we human beings need to do to meet the Paris protocols without any new existing technology. And if we can complete the conversion from fossil to energy to renewables, if we can scale the conversion of industrial production of food and fiber to protocols that build soil health and sequester carbon, and if just as importantly we can continue the expansion of protected areas like Chris and Doug have done to a goal of half Earth, and restore nature, restore at least half the planet to its natural ability to sequester carbon, we can actually save the day. And we don't need to invent anything new. We don't need carbon scrubbers, cleaning the air. And it's a matter of convincing all of us to, in turn, spread the news and get the political will out there to actually get the job done. So as things get more critical, there's still this chance that we'll wake up fast enough to do it, because it can be done, and it wouldn't even require sacrificing the comforts that we have in our life, because nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to go back to the cave. But I am guardedly optimistic that enough of us might wake up in time to do that. And as my David Quammen, who's a buddy of mine, some of you may know David, he's a well-known writer of popular, well, he probably better than any writer today knows how to take really difficult to understand science and making it, into something all of us can read with not just understanding, but real engagement. Best guy out there doing it. And I remember David said, the trouble with despair as a response is that not only is it useless, it's no fun. And I've always took that to heart. We can do this and still enjoy the process. No, the only dangerous critter out there is the Tibetan brown bear, which is very closely related to the Gobi bear that Joe studied. And they're ornery. They're more ornery than the grizzlies you guys have here. So we had bear spray on our rickshaw handles, you know. Yeah. We had bear spray, and then, you know, we also we didn't know if something was going to go wrong. I mean, it almost did. We had to go through a really tight gorge. It was awful. You read about it in the book if you guys got the book, and the carts started to crack and break, and if they broke, if one of them broke through and we didn't have enough to repair it, we were just hosed. Yeah, I mean hosed. So, you know, we were asking ourselves, what are we going to do if the carts break and we're stuck out there? And, you know, we just have the food that's in the cart. So I don't know if it was naive or not, but we brought these things called wrist rockets. You ever seen one of those? And you put a brace on your arm here, and it's these super powerful slingshots. And then we always figured there were rabbits out there, so we thought, you know, we could always live off of rabbits. And then, but we managed, you know, the carts made it through, but we were hungry because we were burning more calories than we had in the cart. Like we were burning probably 5,000 to 6,000 or more a day, maybe 6,500, and you know, it was hard to carry enough food to eat more than north of 3,000 a day, so we were getting pretty skinny. I remember towards the end, we found this nest, this rabbit nest. The mama took off as we got close to it. We walked over, and there was these 3 little bunnies sitting in this nest. And we're just standing there staring at them. And I remember Jimmy said, if Jennifer finds out, she's never going to forgive you. And then Conrad said, we can't do it because the word will get out. So we left him there. And then I remember I was out by myself once we got to the calving grounds, and we were documenting the whole place. And there were wolves out there. We had, you know, the first day of our trip, we had set up camp, and, you know, it was just so wild out there. So first of all, to get there, you know, the carts were collapsible. We had them in shipping carts, you know, that we'd made. They could be taken apart and made into a pretty small package that we could put on the airplane. So we were out there. We in Lhasa, we rented this truck, and we filled it full of gasoline barrels, and then we rented this Toyota Land Cruiser, and we drove out to the west on these roads, and then we drove off the paved road onto a little dirt road, and then the dirt road stopped, and then we just drove across the tundra, and we drove off the whole time off pavement. We drove 1,100 miles off road to get to the farthest we could get where the migration was really starting, and then we put the carts together, and the vehicles turned around and drove back, and there we were. And I remember Conrad said, well, we cut the cord.
Yeah.
And, you know, just, looking around. And then we walked for our first day. Maybe it was the second day. And we set up our tent out in the middle of nowhere. And we're just kind of starting to make dinner. And here comes this wolf. And it walks right into our camp. And it just stood there and looked at us, and then it started howling right in front of us. It's never seen people, you know? So wild, yeah. And then Conrad was going out looking around, and he lives up in Bozeman. I don't know if anybody ever been to Conrad's house, if any of you know him. He's got this tent pole in his living room, and it's this old weathered oak pole with brass ferrules. And the only guy who had ever been through that area where we were was this British explorer in 1898. And we had read his account, and he had tried to get to Lhasa, coming through the back door across western Tibet. And we knew we had done enough research to know we had crossed his path. And Conrad found his tent pole. And then he carried it for a month for another 300 miles.
Really?
And he's got it in his living room. Yeah. Yeah.
We just read that book, and every time I go through a checkout counter now, I see a Butterfinger. I think,
Oh.
do you see those and think of the gorge of despair?
No, but I remember when we were doing our menus, we wanted to take some bars, as climbers call them, and Conrad had done an analysis of all the candy bars you could get and he had done, this kind of caloric analysis, and he'd found out that Butterfingers have more calories per gram than any other off-the-shelf candy bar. So, and when you're a climber, you try to maximize calories. Yeah, so.
I wanted to ask a simple question about what did you ever get from surfing the mountains you never did, but maybe in a large adventure when you kayak a lot, been on the ocean a lot, going on the ocean. What are your concerns on oceans?
You mean what? So what like when I'm sailing?
Yeah, what do you be seeing as it gives you pause and on land, because there are some open areas, but what are your thoughts on the oceans? I know they're in the seas in some areas,
Yeah. Well, I'm no expert on the oceans at all. I don't know if I could even call myself an expert on the mountains, but I've certainly been able to witness, obviously, so many ranges on the earth. But when I was young, even before I started out as a mountaineer, I'd done a little bit of rock climbing, but I was an adventure sailor, and those were my first adventures. So the ocean has always been a strong pull. It's been a pull in my life over the decades as much as the mountains. And in my 20s, that was my main focus. Even though I was climbing on Everest and K2, before that it was all about long-distance sailing. And I sailed about 12,000 miles around the Pacific on mostly small boats. And my first adventure was when I was 19. 5 other buddies, we got on a 36-foot sloop. Kind of was a little crowded, but we sailed from Honolulu to Tahiti, and took 24 days. And that was my first adventure, and it got into my blood. That's not in the book. It was in the original version of it, but the book was so long I had to cut a bunch of stories out, which I'm starting to put on my website. And I think the story about my first adventure sailing to Tahiti, in fact, I know it's on rickridgeway.com if you want to check it out, because it turned into an adventure. Yvonne likes to say that it's only adventure when things start to go wrong. And 2 of us were in charge of navigating. We thought we knew how to do it, because back then it was sextant and chronometer and a bunch of books on spherical trigonometry. And, I was just cursing myself for not paying more attention in math class. But I had I'd taken a course on navigating, and I had a sextant. I still own it. And so one of the other guys had a sextant. He was pretty confident. He knew what we were doing. And our calculations weren't agreeing too well, but they were close enough we weren't too worried. And then after about, 22 or 23 days, we should have seen Tahiti, but there's nothing to be seen. And I remember one morning, the sun had been up for an hour, and I'm at the helm going along, and we're getting a little worried. And a fly landed on the boat. And I just remember, it took me a second, kind of like it took me a minute to realize the butterfly shouldn't be at 23,000 feet, and the fly shouldn't be on a hatch unless there's land. And I just yelled, "Fly!" and everybody comes, and we're all excited because this fly's on the boat. And then sure enough, we saw this island. And the trouble is, it wasn't Tahiti. And then it had a barrier reef around it. And we sailed around the Berry. It was a really stinky island, and we sailed around the reef, and we could see some people on the beach. They were just tiny little figures, but we couldn't find a pass through the reef. And so we were starting to really, what are we going to do kind of thing. And I mean, I was 19. I think everybody else was 20, 21, you know. And none of us really knew what we were doing. But one of us was a kind of what today you'd call a geek. And he had been a ham radio operator, you know, like he was this geeky radio guy. And we had a big transistor radio that we used to get the time signal. We used that for navigating. And you'd tune it, you know, it's this long shortwave radio. And so it had a broadcast band on it. And he starts monkeying around with this radio. And pretty soon on the broadcast band, we hear this French voice come on, and we hear this drums beating, and then we hear a guy go, "Radio Tahiti." So he says, okay, we can't be that far away. But we had no idea which way to go. So he went down below, and he got a coat hanger out of the lazarette, the hanging locker, I mean. And he made this loop antenna out of this coat hanger, and then he wired it into the radio, and he made a radio direction finder out of our transistor radio. And then he gets up on the deck and he tunes in, "Radio Tahiti," and he starts moving it around like this, and the signal would get weak, and then he'd move it around, and then finally he got it where it was the strongest, and then he goes, "Tahiti is that way." Or that way. And so we had to guess, you know, what our mistake had been. So we just guessed we were downwind of it, we hoped. And then, so we started going towards the direction he'd pointed, and we sailed all night. And I remember I was down below in the, you know, off watch, and I'd been up all from midnight to 4 watch, and then I'd just kind of fallen asleep, and somebody, just at very first light, yelled, "Moorea!" And we all jumped on deck, and there were the spires of Moorea, the island right across from Tahiti. Yeah. And so we sailed through the day, and we finally arrived at Tahiti, and right offshore of Papeete. This was in 1968. And it was still a little town then. You know, there were no big, tall buildings. And it was too late to go in. It was getting dark, and you couldn't go in without a pilot. And you had to be cleared from quarantine first before you were allowed to go ashore. So we had to sail all night off the entrance to the harbor. And there was just this light wind coming offshore, and there was this smells of land and the warmth of it and the smells. It was just intoxicating. And then the drumming started, and we could hear people yelling, and we heard all these drums playing, and it went on all night long. And it was just, you know, mesmerizing. Then at dawn, the guy came out in his little boat to inspect us, and I remember in French he said, you know, "Pas du monde," you know, we did trying to figure out what he's saying in French, and finally we realized he's saying, "You guys don't have very much food." And then he escorted us into the harbor. And as we got up to where we were going to tie up, there were all these people on shore who were still partying. I mean, it'd been going on all night. We'd been listening to it. And there were these women in these grass skirts, and they were doing this Tahitian dance. And we'd been out to sea for, you know, a month. And we're just staring, you know. And I remember my buddy said, "I'm never leaving," you know. And we had it was July 14th, Bastille Day. And we thought, you know, the biggest holiday of the year, we thought it was just another day at Tahiti, you know. So, yeah. Anyway, that story's in my website if you want to check it out. Yeah. Oh.
Is there any more questions
Yeah.
for Rick?
So are you still in touch with Asia, and what is she doing now?
So Yeah, she became our adopted daughter, and she often stayed with us, and then she had a hard relationship with her mother, and it had been, tense, and it was just the two of them as Asia grew up, and she was 21 when we got back, and it didn't happen right away. It took several months, but little by little, she redefined the relationship on her terms. And then it kind of turned out, that's what her mother really needed maybe. And it started working. And she was successful in school, and she, out of college, she had studied architecture and marketing a little bit. And she went to Portland to apply for a job at Wieden and Kennedy, the famous ad agency in Portland. And it was, a place, I thought Patagonia had a high ratio of applicants to jobs. Like our ratio at Patagonia for most job openings was about 300 to 600 applications per opening. And Wieden and Kennedy's average was 1,400. And when Asia realized how hard it was to get in there, she just said, screw it, I'm just going to be myself. So she didn't get dressed. She wore Levi's and a T-shirt, went in and said, I don't know anything about advertising, but here's what I've done. And she told them about our trip. And they said, you got the job. So she had a great career there, and then their main client was Nike. And she ended up marrying the guy that was her client at Nike. And then he went on to run their New York office. He had 400 creative people under him. And she's had a marvelous career in marketing and advertising and product development. And they've got 2 great kids, and they live in Santa Monica, and I see them frequently. And when they come to our house, my daughters consider her to be their sister in all ways, yeah. So it's just a great landing, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I think we should end it with that, right?
okay. Yeah, they closed the bookstore. If anybody wasn't able to get a book, we have a few more here that we've got, if anybody still wants one, so, yeah. Well,